All right, our next panel is Obstacles and Opportunities, the Impact of State Laws and Constitutions on LGBTQIA plus Youth Rights. I'm particularly excited for this panel because my former boss, Sasha Buchert from Lambda Legal is here, as well as our excellent moderator, Professor Michele Goodwin, Lauren Pruitt, Shanay Watson-Whittaker, who will be here in just a few minutes, and Antonio L. Ingram II. So very excited for this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Goodwin.
Very wonderful. Thank you so much. And can we give a round of applause for our organizers today? I know you've already done that, but Sienna's extraordinary. I am so absolutely proud of our journal, of the staff, of the editors. To bring a convening like this together is months and months of work. It's one group wondering who's going to show up, who can you get, leaning on professors, who are your friends, who, all of that. And then there is that matter that is so important in these times. Let's be clear that today is a matter of courage and how we stand with integrity and how we stand with dignity, and to be called to do that before people expect you to do it. And that's truly been what these amazing Georgetown law students who are members and editors at this journal did before being called to the moment to say, we stand, we think, we want to know, we are curious. They were doing it. And they were pushing forward with thinking about what does this world need in terms of a full expression of human rights, of human rights, of human dignity. What does that call for? What does that look like? And so then, in thinking about their annual symposium, decided that the topic in which we've all been talking about today, our panelists, transcendence, legal efforts to protect and advance LGBTQIA plus youth rights, which is amazing, right? To do that, to be able to think about how do you cast a legal, a social, a cultural narrative that may not exist everywhere, but to do that work which some have described as jurisprudence in exile. And if we're to think about what jurisprudence in exile mean, because that sounds a bit lofty, but we could think about that work as dating back and going back to a case like Plessy v. Ferguson and the dissent, and to think about the famous dissenters, those who have said, I disagree with the majority. I know that the majority has the votes today, but I disagree, and I'm going to tell you why I disagree. And I'm going to chart a pathway forward, right? And so we could think about the jurisprudence in exile as having been Justice Harlan years ago with Plessy v. Ferguson. We could think about that as having been the work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg for a while. I dissent, I dissent, I dissent. And we could even think about that with then these current times too, with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Sotomayor, and often joining them, Justice Kagan. And so I couldn't be prouder than to moderate this panel, Obstacles and Opportunities, the Impact of States, Laws, and Constitutions on LGBTQIA plus Youth Rights, which raises so many issues, and some of those issues taking place right now in our judiciary and will right now in real time before our Supreme Court as we await what this court will do. Now, before I begin with our panelists, and Sasha's first on my list to speak here, I'm reminded of 3 speeches that Dr. King gave in 1966. He gave lots of speeches in 1966, lots and lots. He was getting arrested a lot and a lot. In 66 was like less arrests, right? But still. And they harmonized, I think, for this panel and what has taken shape today. So the first is that Dr. King gave a lecture before a group of physicians in Chicago. This group of physicians who had come together, and what many people really don't know, we don't pay it sufficient enough attention to, the ways in which segregation affected medicine, the ways in which racism and sexism have affected medicine, the ways in which homophobia, transphobia has affected medicine. But at the time, it was not unusual at all in the United States where there were Black people who were dying on the front steps of hospitals that were predominantly staffed by white people who refused to bring them in. Famously, a lot of people who don't know that Sammy Davis Jr. with the whole, remember Sammy Davis, he lost an eye? That eye could have been saved. Why wasn't it? It's because he could not be admitted to a white hospital. Did you know most of his recovery was spent at Frank Sinatra's house in California? Why? Because Frank Sinatra said, I will make sure you have the best medical team available here in my home. Why? Because someone like Sammy Davis Jr. couldn't get the medical care that he needed. There was a whole civil rights movement around medicine that many people don't know about. So in 1966, Dr. King is before a group of doctors explaining why a civil rights agenda is important for medicine. And he said, of all of the inequities, of all of the injustices, that involving health is the worst. It's the most inhuman. It's been translated to say inhumane, but he actually said it's the most inhuman. And that to me sounds more profound than inhumane, that it's inhuman when you deny people the medical care that they need, that it's inhuman. And he said, because people can die. That year as well, Dr. King was actually recognized by Planned Parenthood, and many people don't know this. Planned Parenthood and Dr. King received a Human Rights Award from Planned Parenthood. Now, I like to say that on that night he was being arrested, which is why his wife, Coretta Scott King, gave the speech that he wrote. And we know that it was Dr. King that wrote the speech and not just his wife, because he followed up to Planned Parenthood after writing to the president saying, and those were my words. And he began the speech with saying that if a group of aliens came from outer space, they would say that our country is governed by a group of insane men. His words. And the speech went on to say insane because of the failure to recognize the concerns of women, the health of women, the reproductive security of women. And he connected it to economic issues. He said that it was cruel to force a woman into a parenthood that she did not want. Cruel for a child to come into a parenthood where the parents just weren't ready for it, didn't want it. His words, that was cruel. And he talked about the socioeconomics of that cruelty. And then the final speech that I want to reference, which I think stitched the first two together, and I think says so much about the convening today and what our panelists will speak to, was in the state of Wisconsin, where Dr. King was giving a speech, and afterwards, given the reporting on Dr. King and talking about medicine and healthcare, talking about women and women's rights and reproductive rights, talking about environmental justice. And this reporter asked, well, it doesn't look like you being arrested in the South and voting rights and Black people. So why? It doesn't look like what we're presuming is your lane. And Dr. King said, I refuse to segregate my moral concerns. I refuse to segregate my moral concerns. And it seems to me that the power of what today represents and the fortitude and the courage and the intellectual vibrancy of today and our journal staff and editors is that they refuse to segregate their moral concerns. And that with that, we can now go to this panel, Obstacles and Opportunities, the Impact of States, Laws, and Constitutions on LGBTQIA plus Youth Rights. And Sasha Buchert, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody attending today. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend the first part, but I'm sure it was amazing. I guess before jumping in, I just think, it's just impossible not to acknowledge this moment, that we're living in. And I just want to applaud everybody in this room for, everything that you're doing. I've never, I think things in our history have been way worse, but they're pretty effing bad. And I just want to thank you for, participating and for, standing up, and there's just so much cowardice that you see on the front page of the newspaper every morning that is heartbreaking, to be honest. And not everybody's able to be visible, everybody's able to fight, but for those that can, everybody that's doing everything they can do, I just want to express my deep appreciation and thank you for what you're doing. I think that, we had a range of different things that we were going to probably talk about as a panel, but like one of the questions that was posed was, with regard to me in particular, was a question about, whether, when we think about litigation and challenges, whether we should consider, bringing federal claims or state claims, I think is a piece of this, and also just what to do, when you get to the end of the road in some context, so I think that's a part of the conversation as well. But I think in line with, the discussion about standing up and fighting, I'm not, a reckless idiot. I'm not going to go out and create bad case law precedent, but I think it's really important that groups like Lambda Legal and the ACLU and other folks stand up. And when there's, extreme hardship, especially when we're talking about healthcare, and so in particular, I'll just raise, 2 examples. One is, there was a healthcare ban that was passed in Texas a couple of years ago. And, we, along with the ACLU, my colleague Harper over here, so we're on the same team, decided that, we can't let this stand. We have options. You're either gonna let this go into effect and, thousands and thousands of, transgender youth are gonna be denied care that they desperately need. Or do you move forward? And if you do move forward, I don't know if you know anything about the composition of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Based on their laughter, they do.
Yeah. I worked on judicial nominations in the last Trump administration, and let me tell you, but the Texas Supreme Court is not great either. So, you have to look at, and then, we also consider the different kinds of claims that are available, when you decide to move forward with a state claim or a federal claim, and the case law precedent. And, we looked at all things considered and said, the chances of getting a really bad, even a district court judge in federal court are really high in Texas. And whereas there are, some jurisdictions where you're more likely to get, your day in court. And so, we decided that the best course of action was to file it in a trial court, in state court. And, and I think in thinking about state and federal options, everybody's probably pretty familiar with the federal options, but, we got some interesting lessons with the Texas system. Because even though we were able to secure, a really, after a mini trial, we were able to secure, a really powerful injunction on the trial court that sunsets unless you go straight to the Court of Appeals, even though you won, even though, the defendants didn't appeal, they just sunset it, and you have to get another decision from the Court of Appeal. And we were able to do that, and to make a long story short, we were able to secure a huge victory based on basically 3 claims. One is what they call the due course of law in the state level, which is pretty consistent with state constitutions, and it's basically a due process, substantive due process, a right that gives parents the fundamental rights to provide the best care for their kids, and that's something that's consistent that we've seen across the board, in talking about the healthcare litigation in particular, both state and federal, the vast majority of courts that have, weighed in on this have found that, the care is that medically necessary, and that B, parents have a fundamental right to give their kids the best care that they can. And we also filed a claim under, the Equal Rights Amendment, which Sienna posed in the question, and also just a equal protection claim. And we're able to successfully get a victory there on both counts, and then it was appealed to the Supreme Court, who overturned it. To make a long story short, that's one of this. We were able to withhold, have an injunction for some period of time protecting kids, but then the law finally went into place. But we have seen victories on the state level in Texas that we're still litigating, involving using regulations that protect against child abuse to prevent the state from imposing a regulation that would go into families' homes and tell them that they need to stop providing care for their kids, or they're going to be subject to removal. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, so what I want to do with each panelist is allow for a little bit of an opening, and then I have a series of questions that we'll walk through. So thank you so much That was great. That was very helpful. Lauren.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Pruitt, and I'm the legal director of FreeState Justice. A little bit about FreeState. We are a statewide organization that provides, a nonprofit that provides free legal services for Maryland's LGBTQ+ community. We also do education and outreach, and then I have a policy team that works on the legislative side and legislative matters in Maryland. So I want to thank you for having me here. A little bit about myself. I am a graduate of Georgetown Law School, so I really appreciate being back. I had to remember where Goodwin was. And oh, okay. I appreciate that. And actually, this year marks my 20th reunion, so that means I'm old. And,
Black don't crack.
So thank you again for having me here. At FreeState, we work on all manners of civil matters relating to the LGBTQ+ community. And I will say that matters concerning youth, it's just kind of a different experience as an attorney and as an advocate. I was part of the juvenile justice clinic at FreeState, which in law school, which kind of let me know that I could never do criminal law because I would just take every client home, and I think that's frowned upon. But working with the youth and thinking about it on a level of we don't do enough in the United States of America. And I think a lot of people have a feeling that we are ahead of a lot of countries. We are not when it comes to the rights of children, the rights of youth, protections that that children have. It is a different experience when we are talking about folks that are already marginalized, already have a limited number of protections, the varying differences depending on what state you live in, and that's obviously with children's rights, with women's protections, and so many other instances of our just general well-being makes these issues so much more important. And I'm happy to talk about that with you all today. And again, thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And then Antonio.
Hi, everyone. This is on, yes. Thanks for having me. My name is Antonio. I'm one of our senior counsel at the Legal Defense Fund. Really happy to be here. I feel like for me, this work was almost accidental. I do a lot of educational equity work in places like Texas and Alabama, and we oftentimes fight using policy and organizing and comm strategies and litigation, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion laws. One of my cases was in Texas where we represented a group of Black families who were in a really racist school district. But we also represented students in that district who were being harassed because of their gender identities and their sexual orientations. And even in Texas, when we fight against the anti-DEI laws there, even on the HBCUs, they closed down a queer resource center first. And so I think in this moment, it's really important to think about how a lot of attacks on queer young people are under the guise of certain other attacks, right? They may say they're initially coming for Black people, but I think they come for a lot of our communities that are intersectional, especially at the state level. And so why I think it's really important to not forget about what the Trump administration is doing. Alabama, South Carolina, Texas is still having their issues, and we need to make sure we keep in mind those communities as we do our advocacy, and happy to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, well, with that, let's get this started. All right, so much attention has been focused on the attacks on LGBTQIA youth rights at the federal level. And Sasha, you opened it up with a bit more about what's taking place at the state level. If we could just put out on the table, what are the kinds of things that have come across your radars that involve youth, which we should be paying more attention to, but may not be being picked up as meaningfully or as forcefully in news? So who'd like to start us off there? What's coming across your radar?
I'm happy to start. I think probably one of the most important things is to realize that the states have the most direct control over children's rights, youth rights in this country. things like family law, educational requirements, standards, the regulation of even like alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, the age of consent, age of marriage. I think child marriage is legal in like 37 states, the regulation of medical care. So it really is important that we are paying attention to what's happening in the states and by the states, and obviously the federal government's control over those, the removal of, the Department of Education, things like that, that will give us, some sort of standardization across the country. There are many states that go further to protect, obviously, their children and youth, but obviously there are many states that are trying to take away rights, especially from LGBTQ plus youth and families, and the ability of families and parents to make decisions for those children.
Laura, I'd like to ask you, and others, I would love to hear you fill in, but one of the things that you mentioned there was marriage. And it strikes me as that there's a strange irony there. So that there are states in which there are kids in these times, within the last decade, as young as 10, being married in the United States. And so many between 10 and 14. So we're not even talking about these cases of the 16-year-old, they're the couple and, they've decided they want to, get, married. But we're talking about significant numbers of kids. There's an organization that is working on these issues, trying to change those states' laws, et cetera. What's the irony that you see? On one hand, no trans affirming, care at all, and yet at the same time, you can be 11 and married, right? How do you reconcile any of that?
Can I add another irony?
Yeah, please.
Child labor. It's so disgusting.
Yes, which is actually coming back, where there are states that are proposing that kids would be able to work 40-hour week. And there are some states that are considering lowering the driving age so that these kids can get to work at 13 and 14 years old, which you can't make that up. How do you reconcile?
I mean, I probably we could just add to the ironies, but the other one that strikes me is the fact that when they say no gender affirming care, they never talk about the gender affirming care that happens to newborns, to for like heteronormative surgeries, for folks who are intersex or have other medical.
Even in the scrimetti, I mean, the Tennessee law itself, right? The Tennessee law that undergirds the case that's at the Supreme Court is one that explicitly on its face says it is okay to have gender affirming care if you identify as hetero, if it's cis. You just don't get gender affirming care if in fact you don't identify as heterosexual.
It's up to us to decide your gender.
Yeah, that it's the state to decide. And it seems to me that you springboard another issue, but I'm looking at you, Antonio, in case you want to get in here, because I'm thinking that the issue, it's the state placing a hand within families, it's individuals not being able to make these decisions for themselves. It's the state saying it's okay that you can get married at 11, but you can't have, your parents can't help and support you with the care that you need. It's all of those things.
Yeah, think about it really from an education standpoint. A lot of my clients and cases involve critical race theory bans in higher education. And so you're telling these kids that they could die for our country. They could literally have a whole host of sort of responsibilities, but they can't learn about queer studies. And just the irony of the type of paternalism that is selectively deployed, especially on population that the state finds to be disfavorable. I think it is quite troubling.
Mm-hmm. To the point that you were making, Lauren, one other piece of this is the sort of anti-science, anti-medicine that is woven within this. The president's executive order that there are only two sexes, and in fact,
At conception.
At conception, right, right. Right, exactly, which is actually not medically or scientifically true at all. I think a lot of people don't know that in the 19th century, it was a common thought that there were about almost 10 different sexes as scientists were thinking through what makes a sex. And so a century ago was a very different thinking than what the president has just recently put forward. I don't know if you all want to add anything more to that before because we could beat that horse of that craziness. But let me pick up then, Antonio, where you left off, which is, I think, critically important, which is how do intersectional issues interweave in thinking about these matters, both with regard to children and then also the transphobia that we're seeing, the homophobia that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it really is about solidarity. I can talk about my case in Texas, where we had a situation where essentially after the sort of racial justice uprising in 2020, the school district in Southlake, Texas, decided to implement a plan to essentially increase diversity initiatives in their school to sort of remediate issues with racial slurs and homophobic bullying. And that school district ended up in litigation. And there's a decision that was sort of brought to the Black parents, and they said, we will give you your equity if you allow us to not implement anything for the queer students and their families. And luckily our client said no, because they know that this sort of piecemeal acceptance would eventually come back and harm their families just as well. Also, some of them have like queer Black children, right? And so just like the false binary that oftentimes the powers that be create in our communities that we all know is not a true reflection of the diversity and sort of camaraderie of so many of our people groups. I think you have to remember that in advocacy as well, because I can imagine, especially in this current moment, some lawyers would have recommended to our clients take the deal. They would have tried to have a more myopic worldview to get piecemeal remedies when in the long term it sort of undermines all of our rights as a collective.
That also reminds me then, before I get to shield laws, about how to be effective in terms of movement, right? Which I think that you've touched upon. I mean, we see in this time where there are communities coming forward and saying, well, I thought it only would affect those people over there. I didn't think that it would affect me and who, I am. And I wonder if you want to speak to that, and then I'll introduce our next panelist who just joined us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is about being aware of sort of how oftentimes when people are transphobic, they're also probably racist. Like there's not this sort of selective bigotry that we hope exists. People are pretty holistically, I think, full of animus nowadays. And so you have to attack these issues from that lens, right? That they will not be selective in their encroachment of our rights. So we have to work in coalition to really defend our communities.
I'd like to welcome Shanay Watson-Whittaker, who's the director of the Michigan Campaigns for Reproductive Freedom for All. Welcome. I know that you made the flight in, so you deserve the applause for getting here.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Shanay Watson-Whittaker. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the director of Michigan Campaigns with Reproductive Freedom for All. Also, the former deputy campaign manager for Proposal 3. The first ballot initiative that actually codified road protections in our Michigan State Constitution.
All right, thank you so much. You're welcome. So I'd like to turn to the ways in which states have sought to try to protect, and we see this both within the reproductive health rights justice space, but then also articulations and spaces that would also protect same-sex equality, that would protect gender-affirming care, that it would affect and protect trans individuals. But there are challenges to the SHIELD laws that are emerging. So first, I'd like to ask if you would describe, who might feel comfortable describing what's happening on the SHIELD front, and then what you see as any kinds of vulnerabilities with regard to SHIELD protections. Sure.
Well, for me in Michigan, we were fortunate enough to have a trifecta from 2022 because of Proposal 3. And we did put protections in place for LGBTQIA folks. That also includes obtaining IDs. There was so many barriers for folks to obtain IDs. Fortunately, we had a state representative, her name was Lori Kohetsky, who championed this. And I'll make this point because I love her so much and she's one of my close friends. She's the first openly LGBTQIA House Speaker in Michigan's history. So she spearheaded that effort to make sure that those protections were put into place for LGBTQIA people. Now, we know the work is not done. We see what's going on with our federal government, what's under attack. But I can tell you this is that she, along with other folks that are in the LGBTQIA caucus in Michigan, are gearing up for a fight. We want to make sure that folks are protected. We also have a governor, fortunately, Governor Whitmer, who's also a champion of marriage equality and LGBTQIA rights. So we're getting ready for what's going on in Michigan. So you'll see more and more legislation down the line from our state legislators. And of course, us at Reproductive Freedom for All, although I'm not speaking on behalf of that organization, but the coalition that I do belong to will be on the front lines, making sure that there are protections in place, that we don't go backwards to a time where hate is so apparent. I tell people, I say, we're going back to 1954, pre-board, Brown versus Board of Education. And like you just said, all of it is intertwined. We talk about intersectionality. So what's going on with our LGBTQIA community is also impacting people of color, because the intersectionality, they're going to come for one of us, they're going to come for all of us. And I'm glad that we do have folks in Lansing that are putting protections in place and continuing to fight to make sure that Michigan is a safe haven for LGBTQIA folks.
So to unpack that further, and thank you so much for that, one of the things that's being seen on the reproductive health rights justice front, which one I think can see and extend to this space as well, is that, and it's intertwined, are these efforts to protect doctors, right? So the effort is to say, you're a doctor in state X, you'll be protected for doing the care that is legal and that is medically appropriate, culturally sound, and where there's been informed consent. There are states that are looking to now extradite doctors to punish them back where patients will come from. Right now, there's a case that involves Texas and New York. Louisiana is also within the space of this, where there's a doctor in New York who's been providing care and who has provided, in this case, mifepristone. It's been placed in the mail. And there's a case of a mom being prosecuted who helped her daughter by providing the mifepristone. Texas is seeking to extradite the doctor from New York. The governor in New York has said, no, over my dead body will this doctor have to leave New York, that New York will release this doctor to be in Texas for punishment. But you can see that on the horizon. And within the context of that on the horizon, in states like Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, and others, there are lawmakers that are even calling for the death penalty of doctors who violate their laws. And in some instances, the patients too, right? So what's the response that you all have? What's your thinking to this? I mean, and I realize that this is all new, so I don't expect that there's a treatise. You've not written treatises on this. This is new. We've never had situations before in our country, so it's very fresh. So I'm asking you a fresh question off the cuff, because we've not had this before. It's not like I'm asking you to refer back to prior legal cases or where this has been debated before. Even in the 1950s, we didn't have this. And on that point, when we think about the Scrimetti case, I mean, it's been the last 3 years that we've had, 19 states passing laws that would make it punishable, providing gender-affirming care. So this is fresh. So what are your thoughts about the whole SHIELD laws and about, this, well, we can extradite them? How do you litigate that? How do you sort of think around that?
I mean, I'll just say, I think it's important for governors of affirming states to, sign executive orders, providing for SHIELD protections, especially relating to healthcare, including reproductive rights and gender-affirming care. These executive orders need to be very specific. I remember working on Governor Moore from Maryland's executive order. We saw so many iterations of it, making sure that the language is just right. What are we missing? Are we missing anything relating to providers, doctors, do we have all the terms that we would need to ensure that it covers, the most folks, the most providers, the patients? What terminology needs to be defined in it? How specific can we make it? And then once we have those, I think it's important for legislatures to memorialize those executive orders and protections into law. Once we have that, then it's important to ensure we have judges that are going to provide the judicial interpretations that will hold up those protections. And if we don't, what are going to be the appropriate, processes there. So I think there's so many things that go into it, but it's so important to have. And it also brings into kind of the understanding of the general public, right? Because they can start to understand, like feeling like, oh, someone's going to come into my house and take me from a state and bring me back to another state to prosecute me for providing life-saving.
That seemed outrageous 10 days ago.
Right. But I think people are starting to understand it, so we can get the buy-in from the public when we have, these talks, and we have, governors and attorney generals of states that are, being public, right? Not behind closed doors, but being public with their support, especially for the LGBTQ+ community.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I just would agree. Yeah, I think that it's, this is meant to chill. It's meant to, stop people from providing care, so having, as much support as possible from the administrative state is really important. I think also, we've already seen Texas using their consumer protection laws to try to harass providers, and I think we're going to see probably some of that on the federal level.
Can you unpack a little bit more about what that looks like in Texas using the consumer protection laws?
Yeah, their argument is that, that providers aren't telling, patients enough about the risks of gender-affirming care, or that this is a dangerous thing, and that they're, it's just meant to harass and shut down any kind of, treatment at all, even if it's not medical care. It's just a way to, dissuade people from providing care and to go on fishing expeditions to try to get information about providers that actually are providing care. But it's just a way to harass. And I think it's just important that, and they're not going to stop at the Texas border. They're going to continue to harass providers in states, even with shield laws. And I think that's probably part of the strategy.
Yeah, I'd also say maybe also contemplating how to use these tools to protect queer people. As most people probably heard in the news recently, the Supreme Court will be looking at a case about conversion therapy next year. What if blue states pulled in these people who are making our people experience harm, right? I think there's ways in which we can match energy in a way that historically has not been done effectively by more progressive movements.
Yeah, because I'm then wondering about, what is then the mechanism for moving forward? Because it seems that moving back, there's a playbook. So Sasha, as you were mentioning, for example, these consumer protection laws, and the idea behind them is that somehow you're being duped, which then leads to the idea that somehow this is a threat to your health. Well, that's actually the playbook that Texas was using in order to dismantle reproductive freedoms. Texas was saying, oh, abortions are really unsafe. Abortions really harm you. This is what, were part of the targeted regulations against abortion providers. For years, Texas was doing that, when in fact a person's 14 times more likely to die carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. But that narrative component seems to be really powerful. So I'm wondering if you could tease out or think through, are there any other kinds of ways in which we see the kind of old playbooks being used, and what are the kinds of ways to address those old, playbooks? I'll give you one more example that in Texas they used, which I think people didn't catch on to right away, which was with their SB 8, which happened before Dobbs. Texas had passed this law and went into effect that banned abortions at 6 weeks of pregnancy, and no exceptions for rape or incest, but it had a component to it that allowed people to go after citizens, to go after individuals who aid and abet somebody who's terminating a pregnancy. And right away I thought, well, that's just Fugitive Slave Act.
There you go.
That's what that is. It's not that they're genius. They're just looking back and like, what else can we use? And so I'm wondering if there are any other things that you're seeing that are kind of being pulled from the past into this moment and that we should be thinking about, worried about.
For me, it's pitting people of faith against our trans community. One of the things that I can say was most effective for us in our coalition was bringing people of faith in our LGBTQIA community together in decision-making and how we moved forward as a coalition. And that was very effective. And the conversations around our ballot initiative, and I can say this, we had the LGBTQIA community make sure that it was inclusive, the language is inclusive enough that it didn't discriminate against anybody. And our faith leaders bought into that. And one of the messages that came out of it is, if you target one person, I'm next. So I had preachers at the pulpit who had came together with our community. I could say LGBT Detroit was one of our organizations. Equality Michigan was one of our organizations as well. They were with us in the creation of the language. So you had, again, faith leaders. I am Church of God in Christ. So, I'm saved, sanctified, Holy Ghost filled, fire baptized.
The white sheet.
Yes.
For those of you who don't know.
Yes. And we had pastors saying the language that we used at the pulpit, because they said, if you come for one of us, you're going to come for all of us. And I think that message resonated with folks. In fact, it resonated so much that other states connected with us and they used the same language because it was effective. And they're still with our coalition to this day. There's a sentiment that they're going to, if they come for our trans brothers and sisters, they're going to come for everybody else. So what are we going to do next? So for us, we've been a coalition that's been in place for about 4 years now. We're a resistance coalition, that's what we call ourselves, in lieu of what's happening. And we're letting our Equality Michigan lead the charge. And for me, it's me going to the churches and saying, hey, look, this is what's up. This is what's going to happen next. Don't think that you're the exception to the white supremacy rule. Mm-hmm. And they get it.
Anybody else want to tag in onto that? Like things that you see that are playbooks from the past coming forward or that we should be paying attention to?
I mean, I think also if you look at just the copycat legislation that's coming from different states, especially conservative states. We've seen it in Maryland relating to book bans, relating to parental rights, relating to trans sports bans. And so we really do need to focus on, what the lobbyist movements are doing, especially conservative lobbyists, and, not think like, oh, it's the South, so like, that's fine. It's going to come, to the purple states, to the blue states, to the super blue states, and we have to be prepared for that. Another thought that I had too was that, we are seeing, especially relating to, for example, the trans sports bans. I played sports growing up. I played sports in college at Howard University. And I never remember anyone talking about, more scholarships for women athletes, right? But to hear people talk about not allowing someone to play women's sports because there's this limited number of scholarships seems insane to me, right? Why are we not talking about expanding, right, women's scholarships and really women and access for all to play sports? So, what I'm also seeing is them, trying to pit, different groups against each other. And I, as an athlete, I've played sports and been asked to prove that I am a girl, I'm a cisgender woman. And so I would stand absolutely with a trans woman wanting to play sports, because I don't think either one of us should have to go in a tent to prove that we should be here playing sports or have menstrual cycles in public school offices, or doctor's notes on us, in some secretary's computer in my high school. So I think there's a lot of things that we're seeing that are just being cut and paste from different various aspects. And we have to, as was stated already, be on guard for those and stand together. Coalition building is going to be so important in all of these areas of our lives, and we can't just kind of pick and choose. Because if you let someone put me in a box, eventually you will be standing next to me in your own box.
Well, in fact, to pick up on that question of sports, because that's also been a way of, I think about these things as matters of thought leadership and narrative. There can be thought leadership even if it's crazy and lousy, right? Like, so Project 2025 is a thought leadership project, right? A film like Birth of a Nation is a thought leadership project. Even having the Confederates memorialized on bronze with boas and feathers, marching, is a thought leadership project, right? It's telling us this is the way in which we need to think about these kinds of things. And it strikes me that in the two areas that you both raised are thought leadership projects, right? This sort of raising that religion, the sort of religious cudgel in this space, right? That somehow someone is not going to make it to heaven or wherever unless they're discriminatory. Your child is not going to get the opportunities that your child deserves if there is a trans child that is playing on the team. How do you combat these kind of like thought narrative projects that seem to resonate with people who have this kind of deficit model thinking? Anybody?
I can contribute a little bit. I think it's really interesting because a few years ago, there was that Supreme Court case, 303 Creative. In LDF, we wrote a brief about it to talk about intersectional harms. And in that case, we cited Piggy Park because in the Piggy Park case, sort of years after the...
For those that don't know 303, can you tell them just really quickly what it's about?
Yes, it's sort of the equivalent to the Masterpiece Cake Shop, but for a wedding website designer. This person felt like she would be infringed if she made wedding invitations.
And let's be clear, nobody who was gay or trans went to her asking to use her little website.
Yeah, standing was questionable for that case, of course.
But it was not fabulous enough, okay? Let's be clear.
It was hokey.
But it was interesting because in the case that we cited in our amicus brief, it involved similar facts. There was a white South Carolina barbecue restaurant owner, and he said that he believed that God put people on different continents and that we should not have interracial mixing, and so his restaurant should have an exemption from public accommodation laws because Black and white people should not be eating at the same place. And the court in the 50s said, you can't do that. Like, you cannot hide behind religion to engage in bigotry. And I think we need to continue having those conversations. Because, I go to a church in DC that's affirming. Like, there are churches that love gay people. Like, we can't let Christianity be defined by just this sort of discriminatory ideology that evangelical Christianity typically tries to espouse. There's so much diversity. There's Episcopalians. Like, there's so many branches of Christianity that uplift trans folk and gay folk. And so I think part of that is what we have to push back on, this sort of attempt to monopolize religious communities and to act like there's only one narrative that these communities can hold at one time.
So I wonder, before we open it up for Q&A, so we've got a few minutes and then for Q&A, one way in which the federal government has attempted to intervene at the state level. So to set this up, as you all know, because you're working within these spaces, has been the Supreme Court to say that, well, we'll pivot issues these days to the states, right? Out of the Dobbs decision, which dismantled Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, Justice Alito saying, okay, to the states. But then what we see is that, well, actually not so committed to the states, right? At all, when there are matters of deciding to further discrimination. And so one of the ways in which one can then upend that theory is to use executive orders, right? Which we've heard, that there'll be two sexes at birth, and then the DEI. And so I'm wondering, given that we've touched on a bit, the intersectionality, but not the sort of atmosphere of anti-DEI and what all of that represents. And so I want to touch on that because it seems to me that that's been so weaponized in so many different ways. It's accountable for planes crashing, you know, like anything that makes people feel aggrieved, DEI was the cause of it. So I'm wondering how that has come across your plate, what you're thinking about within the context of that.
I'll just say very generally that we just have to do a much better job at not allowing the other side to define our terms. Even, you know, from DEI to gender affirming care, to so many other things, what it means to be, you know, a person who stands for the people and the terminology that's used. We have to be able to express our beliefs and concerns in a way that take back some of those terms and better define some of those terms. I have so many folks that come to me when, you know, if I'm doing a name change for a minor or, you know, talking with, you know, a school about getting, you know, support for a minor child. And they'll say gender affirming care, and I can tell immediately they just mean surgery. And these are the child's parents. These are the child, you know, the social workers, the guidance counselors. And so when I go into, well, gender affirming care means all these different things, they are shocked. And I'm like, you're talking about taking mental health care from this child. You're talking about just taking away the right to just see your doctor, because I'm a person. And if, you know, if I'm a trans youth, being trans is part of who I am, and my doctor should know that and treat me as such. So if you're taking away my gender affirming care, then should I just not see a doctor, see a dentist? Should I just wither, right? So
according to Justice Thomas.
True, very true. And which is also shocking to me, just based on his marriage. I just can't understand trying to take away.
That was the exception in Dobbs. Everything else should go, but not that.
Right.
That's where he drew the line.
Right.
Yeah.
Loving v. Virginia, fine.
Yes.
Everything else relating to personal rights, not so. It must be nice to be able to, you know, compartmentalize in that way. But yeah, so I really think, and this goes for like all advocates, I spend the time on language when I do trainings, whether it's corporate or government or even with the judiciary. I spend so much time just talking about language and trying to take back what these terms mean, including things like DEI, what that actually means, what it's. I didn't get here because I'm Black. I just got an opportunity to possibly apply for this job or apply at this school or interview at, you know, for a particular position. They increased the pool, not lowered the standards of who they were hiring. And so explaining those things, and when you hear terms used incorrectly, taking the time to say, like, well, wait, back up a second. When you say gender affirming care, like what do you think that means? So I just want to say, like, overall, I think the terminology and the language, especially relating to LGBTQ plus folks, is really, really important.
I agree. I also feel like it's really important to provide context. Even when people say, oh, we want there to be merit again. When was there pure merit in this country? Was it when they excluded us from jobs because of the color of our skin or our gender identities or our sexes? You know, that's such a false narrative. And even now saying, oh, because of DEI, we think people are unqualified. They've always called us unqualified, right? Like that's been their trope from the beginning. Like that's how they created that type of supremacy, by creating lies about our levels of, you know, self-worth and like the ability to really contribute to our society on our own terms, right? And so I think having those conversations and contextualizing those conversations, I think that's the power of narrative versus even law. Because think about, you know, the SFFA decision, we can't use sort of historical remediation in a legal sense anymore, but you can use it in a calm sense. You can talk about why we have these disparities and why they should be remediated. And maybe judges will not be persuaded by that, but I think public opinion can be shaped, and I think we have to use whatever tools we can.
Let me add briefly, when I think of states' rights, I get triggered because it's segregation now, segregation forever, and we see what happened with the federal government with LBJ's ban on segregated facilities and it being basically legalized to discriminate against me. So, you know, folks, they talked about states' rights when it was about reproductive freedom in 2022. And then now we see what's going on possibly with the Comstock Act. Okay, so, you know, there are always go-arounds, get-arounds. And I say to folks, white supremacy is relentless. It is relentless. It's meant to suppress us. It's meant to hurt us. It's meant to dehumanize us. I'm an organizer, activist, advocate. I'm the person that's getting in your face. I'm unapologetic about this, especially around trans rights. And I go to my legislators. If they vote the wrong way, I get on the phone and I'm like, what's up? What's the word? You know what I'm saying? Do I have to call my people to, do I have to call my folks to come at you? You want an endorsement for your election. Your resources are limited. Is this really worth it? Will it really matter to folks in 2 years from now? No. But what's going on in a federal level, you have, as an elected official, you have to be a stopgap for that. And if you are trading in your vote for the moment and not the bigger picture and not thinking about the bigger picture, I don't want you in office. I'll tell people I don't want you elected anymore. I'm very much unapologetic about it.
You know, it seems to me, and I know we got to go to Q&A because other people get to be able to have the fun that I've had of sitting here with you. But you know, it makes me think about the failure of doing that with Jesse Helms in the Senate as long as he was.
Yes.
Who was notoriously sexist, homophobic, racist, unapologetically about it. I mean, just very vocal in that way. And it strikes me that, you know, given the cruelty of what was represented by his position in the Senate and the various committees that he chaired, the fact that that wasn't a sense that, okay, Jesse, be great elsewhere, but you shouldn't be in the Senate. Everything that you represent and that you speak to is really anti-constitutional, anti-democratic, and so forth. So I appreciate that. All right, we have to get to questions, right, from our audience. Okay, let's see, and we have them already, okay.
Questions?
Thank you. So y'all talked a little bit. Great. So y'all talked a little bit about how many of the playbooks we're seeing are ones that we have seen a lot before. What lessons do y'all think we can learn from the generations of folks who have come before us fighting those playbooks?
Yes, the civil rights movement. Yes. That is the blueprint, the ultimate blueprint of what we do today. And a lot of folks think that it was a long time ago because we see pictures in black and white. That is not a long time ago. No. And I can tell you, I'm almost 50 years old. I'm probably the member of the first generation to have full rights. My mom didn't have it. My grandmothers didn't have it. I can tell you my second great grandfather was enslaved here in the United States. And he died in 1938. And I was born in 1977. Think about that. Okay, so it wasn't a long time ago. And what their history has a tendency, especially American history, to repeat itself. And if you all look to the civil rights movement, please, everybody says, I am not my ancestors. No, we are not. They were better than us because they were organized and they were out there and they put their lives on the line for a purpose. And here we are, we're talking yay, I'm not gonna say the word. We're talking yay, a big stuff and not backing it up with action. So there is a blueprint there. What they did was they normalized the conversations around race. I'm not all about the lovey-dovey stuff, whatever, I'm more militant. I have guns in my home. I love the Deacons of Defense. I like that too. But I also recognize that they were strategic in how they did things and normalizing the conversation. And one of the things—
You're the friend that folks want when you're walking home at night.
Yes. If you have to meet my husband. He's amazing. He's just like that, and he runs an organization in Michigan. But what we did is we modeled that. When we talked about abortion, we modeled the civil rights movement and having those conversations and modeling it, going to the churches, going to the synagogues, going into the community, having those conversations, telling our personal stories as well. Once you do that, you give people permission to share their stories, then they can relate. I've had people that would come to me, tell me, oh, I'm not for abortion, blah, blah, blah. But when I tell them my personal story, it's like, you got me. But then they'll say, well, when I was 15 or something, I got pregnant, but I had a miscarriage. What do you think happened when you got sprayed? That's an abortion. And it's like a light goes on in people's heads. So having those conversations, meeting people where they are. And I love Ella Jo Baker's philosophy about bringing everybody to the conversation as well.
Anybody else want to add to that while we go to our next hand raised? All right, we had a hand.
I'll just add quickly, I think HRC said that LGBTQ plus community has like $1 trillion in buying power. I think it's so important that we put our money
Look
where
at what's happening to Target right now.
Exactly.
And I think
Tesla, right?
yeah, well, and that's what a great point in terms of the boycott aspect of that and the financial empowerment, because when you think about, after the horrific deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and organizations, companies saying like, oh, now we'll do something, right? And now all of that going away, that's just 5 years ago. That was just 5 years ago. And I am sure, when Pride Month comes around, there are going to be companies with all of their advertisements and whatnot, the same ones that got rid of their DEI policies. Right, there's a hand.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This was really enlightening. I guess, so a question I had, and the microphone is not happy with me, so I'm going to hold it this way.
All day.
Thanks. I think over the past half a decade, we've seen, I'm just gonna hold it here, you don't have to take it. Over the past half a decade, we've seen sort of states in the trans law front, inch towards a bimodal distribution, right? States sort of inch towards really repressive, laws on one end, and the other end, other states.
Maybe we can turn that one off, and I'll just repeat it up here.
And other states sort of build up more of those affirmative protection. And I guess as we enter the Trump administration, I'm curious if we could see that sort of U-shaped graph changing at all, and if so, does state level strategy change in response to it? I hope I stated that clearly.
Did you get that? Okay, could you just repeat it? Part of that was.
Question. I think over the past half a decade, we've seen state level trans bills enter a bimodal distribution. So there's a collection of states where you're just building up this collection of repressive trans laws, right? On the other end, you have a collection of states that are maybe building up more affirmative protections. And I was curious if you guys see that pattern changing at all as we enter the Trump administration, especially if Gavin Newsom's comments, for example, recently, and if so, does state level strategy change in response?
I can start.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think that, in my opinion, that it's a constantly evolving situation. Tagging on to the response or the question that was asked earlier, I'm from Oregon, and I've been doing this work about 10 years, and I remember being shocked reading an attorney general opinion saying that trans people should not be able to amend their birth certificates, and that has completely changed in Oregon. And I think that's true for some of these more difficult states that we have to continue to do the work to shift public opinion in those places. I don't think it's a given that any of these places are going to always be as they are, or that California is always going to be what California is. And but I do think that there is concern with the shift, and I think there is a gross relationship building between the red states and the Trump administration for sure.
All right, and I think we have another couple questions.
Hello? Thank you. I have more of a comment, and I invite reaction to it. So my name is Brianna Jenkins. I'm the policy director at Lavender Rights Project. We're the largest Black trans-led advocacy org in the country, based in Seattle. But I live in Houston, Texas. So live in a red state, working in a blue state. First thing is, I think we should talk to our elders, particularly I'm thinking of trans elders, Black trans elders who are still alive, who have, we have a director of programs on our staff, a Black trans woman who just turned 75 years old today. So our elders are still alive, and they are still watching us, and they still need things, and they lived through all of this, so they have lots of wisdom. So I would encourage everybody to talk to the queer elders in our life. Two, I will say that doing policy work in a blue state, It's definitely encouraged me, well, not encouraged me, I've seen how performative some of the blue states have been. In Washington State, we also are in a trifecta. And what we have seen is a lot of politicians, a lot of organizations in statewide, but also in Seattle start to comply in advance and start to back out and start to be less imaginative, even with a trifecta. And it's made it very hard to be in relationship and to really trust people because Trump and MAGA is very much alive in Washington State and all of the blue states. So I was wondering if folks, particularly for people who are doing policy work in blue states, have you experienced that as well? And also I'll say that everybody, I'm not a student, but everybody's not going to be a litigator. Some of y'all might be in policy. So I think it's great to know these lessons too, just in case you might be a policy director or associate one day.
And what I want to do is just take the other couple questions and then you all can answer them together just in light of time. Okay, so if we can, there were a couple other hands that were up. We can grab those and then you can answer.
Hi, thank you so much. My question was about, it's really inspiring in some ways to hear about state laws and progression on that level. But I think also sometimes I get the fear, as inspired as I am by state laws, I wouldn't want to leave behind the possibility of a future where there are federal level protections. So I was also curious how you guys feel like you balance the need to like really fight on the state level these days, which I think is really inspiring, while also making sure that none of the states get left behind.
Mm-hmm. And then our last question, and then you can pick those up.
Is there a last question?
Thank you so much. We talk a lot about states' rights, and but here in DC, we're actually in a little bit more of a precarious position. And so I know not everyone is an expert on DC, but one of the things I'm wondering is if we lose our already limited home rule, like what do you see in store for trans kids and their parents? And one of the things that's happening is like a lot of parents are also scared. They're scared of prosecution. They're scared, and so especially if they have teens who are on like medicalized gender affirming care, HRT. So what do you see as, like what's going, like, I know there's no crystal ball, but like, what do you foresee as potential protections or lack of protections for those kids and their parents here?
All right, where would you like to start?
I can start with the state versus federal balancing. Mm-hmm. I think for me, it really is about the subject matter of what we're talking about, because even looking at a lot of the Trump executive orders, currently education curriculum is based on state law. They can use like, Department of Education and maybe like pull levers and like coerce people into certain actions. But in terms of like what is being taught, that's Alabama law, that's Texas law, that's South Carolina law. And so my fear is, while we are litigating these Trump EOs and hopefully, we have a different president in a few years, these state laws aren't going anywhere. They don't dissipate upon administration changes. And I think we need to remember that those communities are almost in some ways, I think, being overshadowed now because of the federal fights. And that's among a lot of even national nonprofits, right? Like I woke up this morning in Birmingham and I love that, right? Because I think those communities, talk about intersectionality, they're now being assaulted by both the federal and states. And so I think insofar we can alleviate that simultaneously, we need to still work towards that.
Yeah.
Sure, and for Brianna's question or comment, in Maryland, kind of what I'm seeing is, let's say our policy team is tracking, there may be 3 bills that mention LGBTQ plus community, but if we read into the hundreds of bills that have been proposed, there may be 60 plus bills that will really impact the LGBTQ plus community. So what we're seeing is that we can't just let them, say, hey, this bill is the anti-trans bill or the anti-LGBTQ plus bill. We need to read into all bills because, some of them will say, like the parental rights bill. And I'm like, oh, as a parent, that's lovely. That sounds great. I would love to be more involved in my kids' education and have a say. But then when I read into it and I listen to the testimony from Moms for Liberty, I'm like, oh, you mean everyone except for me. Right. And so we have to be mindful that they see, especially in blue states, like, oh, if we, give them some bills to like latch onto and promote and market and, against in their social media, these other 60 bills may get passed that really have some teeth and really will allow them to ban books and keep books out of public libraries, school libraries, not allow, my child to mention that maybe they have two moms, and allow kids to just opt out of just everything relating to gender identity and sexual orientation when in school. So it becomes really important in these blue states to really focus on, like the background of the bills, where they're coming from. Again, looking at other states that passed similar bills with similar language, who were the sponsors of those and the lobbyists behind those bills, just to make sure that we are fighting bills that are impacting our community, not just bills that mention our community.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I could just say briefly, Michigan now is a purple state in 2024, and earlier this year, Josh Schreiber, he is a piece of bleep in Michigan, he had introduced a resolution to overturn Obergefell, and it got a lot of traction from not just from the LGBTQIA community, but everybody else. And folks are like mobilized to say, okay, this is where the Oxford shooting happened. Why are you not focusing on keeping schools safe? Why are you trying to make people unsafe? So we pounced on that and basically said to him, take care of your job here. And that also made him vulnerable. And so we're going to target him for the next election cycle and other elected officials once they do that. But we also have to, and I'm gonna say this briefly, I don't know if y'all heard about the SAVE Act that's coming up. It makes it harder for people. Your name on your birth certificate has to match your voting ID. It primarily impacts women, but it also impacts trans people too, because your birth certificate name may be different from what's on the voting roll. So it's going to make it impossible for people to vote. And I'm proud to say that my Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, has been screaming about this and talking about this all over the country. So it's all a ploy to basically make it harder for us as citizens, people who are marginalized, to have full citizenship in this country. But we just have to keep nailing and just pounding them, making sure that folks are really revved up about this, especially with what's going on with healthcare and now Medicaid and all that other stuff that's going on in the states and federally now.
Have any response to any of the questions? So with that, do we have just one last moment? Not for a question, but I was going to lead it from here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I want to ask you this as we wrap up, and I think it's a question for everybody in this room and beyond, which is, how are you coping with this moment, with the onslaught? Because I think that for so many who want to be active, they want to do everything, feel maybe guilty if they're not at the latest protest, right? How do you give advice, especially with so many of our students in the room who are feeling that way and might be feeling guilty about, I'm in class now, but shouldn't I be someplace else? How are you coping, and how are you thinking about dealing with the daily onslaught?
Yeah, I really am a big proponent of self-care. I go to brunch, I go to church, I have community. Because racism, homophobia, transphobia, they're not going anywhere anytime soon.
Have that brunch, right? Okay, let's get into it, right?
And so, you just have to view this as a marathon, not a sprint, because, especially in a nonprofit impact litigation world, people get burnt out quickly. And so you have to make this a sustainable career and a sustainable advocacy. And I think that requires not always being reactive and feeling like you have to be at every single event or do every single action.
For me, someone asked me this question actually yesterday, a similar question. And I said, I lean on my ancestors. Mm-hmm. I know what they've been through. They've told me their stories, and I move forward in that, because we know that when my eyes close, the work is not going to end. but I know I've done my part to make sure that this place is better, especially my state of Michigan.
Lauren?
And I think, and this kind of, just to talk to the question about what to do as a parent in DC, you know, for myself, you know, I talk to service providers. We talk about, you know, instead of saying gender dysphoria, what other, you know, possible like medical diagnoses, if it's just relating to hormone imbalance, or other ways to write notes that are obviously still accurate, but can protect that patient if, you know, there's some, you know, mass, like we need all of your patient records. And so we can all be out there, you know, in our own capacities, helping and pushing kind of the movement forward. Maryland is a sanctuary state, so, you know, please come on over from DC if you need to. But I think if whatever you're good at, like if you are great at posting on social media, find a nonprofit that you like and help them with their social media posts. If you know, like to be at protests, then, you know, that could be your thing. But if it's not, that wasn't my thing, because I obviously, as you know, African-American person, I generally don't like to be places where they could just decide to arrest everyone. And I have, you know, a career and things to think about, and family. So I, you know, will support movements in other ways. And I think figuring that out for yourself is really, really important. And you know, as I stated, you can show up in the ways that are important to you and impactful to you in this movement. But there are so many nonprofits out there that could use support, whether it's just helping with phone calls or emailing, also just showing up, testifying. I hear from legislators so many times that say, you know, oh, like all the, you know, the folks that are in, you know, these organizations testifying is important, but the most impactful one was that mom that showed up, or the teenager from this particular school system to tell about their experiences. And also, you know, showing up, you get to see that, wait, this person should never be in politics again, right? You know, I've had a legislator tell me to explain something to them like they were in 4th grade. And we were talking about, you know, solitary confinement in prisons. And so like all that told me was like, you did no reading, you have no idea what this bill is about, and you want me to explain it to you as if you were a child. You should not be in power anywhere. And so if people who elected that person were there and watching, it's possible that they wouldn't be there in the next cycle. So however you can make an impact, you know, that feels good to you and protects yourself, I think you should.
Stop doom scrolling. I know you're all doing it. That's it.
Okay. That's a good one. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I promise I have pinged AV about the mics. Oh, AV is here, excellent. Thank you again, another round of applause, please, for this excellent panel. And a special shout out to Shanay, who dealt with the work emergency and still made it here anyway. Appreciate all the work that you all are doing. We're gonna break until 4, if that's okay with our next panelists. And by the way, after this will be our final panel, and then we will head straight to the happy hour in the Sport and Fitness Center lobby, where many of our panelists will be joining, not all, but many. So if you have any burning questions that you didn't get the chance to ask, please feel free to badger them about it as they sip on wine and eat some fresh fruit and cupcakes. We ran out of lunch, but I don't think we'll run out of alcohol. That shows where my priorities lie. Antonio, I think there's a bucket of bottomless mimosas for brunch with our name on it. All right, go take a break, and I'll see you back at 4.